Hello, everybody. Welcome in. We are so excited that you are here today to hear an awesome presentation. I am just going to give everybody a few moments to get situated and grab some water, some coffee, whatever you're in the mood for. And I will call everybody back in about 3 minutes. So just hang tight, get situated while we let everybody filter in to this webinar. Thank you so much. If you just entered this webinar, welcome. We're just going to give everybody 1 more minute to get situated before we start our presentation. So just hang tight. All right, looks like we are ready to kick it off. So once again, welcome. We are so excited you're here to listen to this webinar. Today we have an incredible topic for you on 10 key lessons learned in the field on breach and attack simulation. And at this point, I will now turn it over to Andrew.
Cool, thanks so much. And so thanks for the intro. So hello everyone, and welcome to this talk today. As ever, I just want to start off by just thanking you all in advance for obviously taking the time out of your busy schedules to join today's webinar. And wherever you are in the world, it's a pleasure to have you. So if my slides will move. There we go. So a little bit of background about me. So I'm Andrew Costis. A lot of people know me as AC, and I work at Attack IQ as a senior cyber threat consultant. So just some brief background. So I actually joined Attack IQ last April 2021, and my day job primarily consists of working with global enterprise customers, helping them to implement the Attack IQ security optimization platform, and obviously helping them to test and validate their security controls using a combination of threat and adversary emulation. And amongst other things, I also help them to operationalize the attack framework, the MITRE attack framework that is, as well as implementing purple teaming, practice a threat-informed defense approach to their security programs. So I guess fundamentally, in essence, I kind of primarily what I do is implement their security optimization program, as well as the practices that surround it. So before joining Attack IQ, I worked as a senior threat researcher for around 5 years or so, and I spent much of that time reverse engineering malware, tracking e-crime, including numerous ransomware campaigns and families, as well as writing detection and analytic rules with the occasional threat hunting and incident response. And so in total, I've been in the industry for about 20 or so years. I've actually lost count, it's been that long. And just in case anyone's somewhat familiar of this talk and the content, I did actually give this talk at DEF CON at the Adversary Village only last month. So it is a slight adaptation of that talk for this audience. So apologies if you were there and this sounds familiar, but I have made some subtle changes just to kind of spice it up a little bit. So before we kind of jump in, I just want to spend a minute or so just talking about the motivation for today's talk. So as I mentioned previously, before joining Attack IQ, predominantly I had a kind of blue team background. And when I joined Attack IQ, generally speaking, there was kind of a limited amount of information in the industry to do with adversary emulation and breach and attack simulation and so on. And just like anything in our industry, right? Only a certain amount of training will get you so far, but it's really having the hands-on experience and exposure, which is where you're going to learn the most from. So this talk really is based on my own journey since I've been with Attack IQ, talking to these global enterprise organizations, assisting them with trying to implement breach and attack simulation, obviously the Attack IQ platform, and actually put things into practice like the buzzwords that I've mentioned, adversary emulation, purple teaming, and so on. And so, in essence, I kind of, coming up to my first year around sort of April, May time, I started to reflect on, if I was to kind of do this again, what would I do differently? What advice would I give to my past self? And what things I might consider if I were, to head up my own adversary emulation or purple teaming project, for example. So, fundamentally, this talk really is to just share some of that experience, some practical tips and tricks based on my own journey. The talk is actually not super technical, so some of you may be disappointed, some of you may be pleased, but I wanted to kind of steer it and gear it towards, a mixed audience really, so both technical and non-technical folks. And the reason for that really is I think you need the combination to kind of get the program off the ground and implement things like adversary emulation and purple teaming. Now, I'm sure some of you that are kind of tuned into this, I'm sure those of you that have obviously got experience, possibly been doing it for a lot longer than myself, but hopefully you'll still kind of get some usage out of this, and hopefully, if nothing else, it will be a good refresher for you as well. But particularly anyone that's new to this space as well, hopefully you'll get the most out of it, because it will be a good recap and kind of overview for things to consider. So obviously I've listed a bunch of terms on this slide. So this talk is somewhat related to all of them. Some of these terms are in fact used interchangeably, but whether you're implementing a breach and attack simulation platform, whether you're doing threat and adversary emulation, whether it's red, blue, or purple teaming, or even if you're kind of doing your own kind of do-it-yourself, in-house projects, bring your own TTPs, as I kind of coined the term. It really doesn't matter. The overall kind of concept applies to each of those different terms. And just the last note before we dive in. So although each of the top 10 lessons or kind of guides are numbered, they're not actually in any particular order. So please don't go away and follow all of the 10 lessons learned as you must follow them in order. So they're just really in no particular order. And just in reference to the previous slide with some of those terms like breach and attack simulation and purple teaming, I've assumed for the purpose of this webinar, just a very basic high-level conceptual understanding of what those mean. So you don't need to be a guru, you don't need to be an expert. There are plenty of great talks out there that actually do dive into some of those terms in a lot more detail. But I just wanted anyone who has any sort of vague, high-level kind of conceptual understanding of what these terms mean. That's all you need. You don't need to be an expert. Alrighty, so first off then, just like any old map, right? So at first glance, we might look at a map like the Underground in London, and it might appear confusing, right? But with a sufficient level of detail, we can add context, which then in turn adds clarity, which then in turn helps making that map become a quick reference guide easy to read, easy to digest, no matter what your experience level is, no matter what your language you speak, and so on. And it kind of really the same applies to breach and attack simulation. So understanding the environment is such a key element, and I would even go as far as to say that it's not even strictly about breach and attack simulation. This is just defense in general. You should really start at understanding the environment. So, you know, this is hugely beneficial, and sadly is very often overlooked. Now, obviously, you know, you could in theory run, you know, some kind of blind adversary emulation campaign or assessment against an unknown environment that you know very little about. However, there's a very strong possibility that you're going to run into many challenges and obstacles by doing that. So, you know, this isn't a mandatory step. As I say, none of these steps are necessarily mandatory. These are just kind of what I consider to be really important steps, and at least things to consider when you build out your program. But, you know, in an ideal world, there will hopefully be some information available at your disposal to make life a little bit easier. Now, it's one thing I should add is, you know, it's important to never assume that the information about the environment is always kept up to date, and it may not always be accurate. It may not always be maintained. So, you know, it's very common that you may have a snapshot of, you know, certain components of the network environment, for example. So, you know, this is kind of using your best brain to kind of piece together this jigsaw of what your environment looks like, to essentially make your life easier as you get a bit further along once you've kind of deployed your breach and attack simulation platform and so on. Now, obviously, if this information isn't available to you, which is quite common, then it might be a good time to regroup internally with your various teams and try and actually go on that journey together and find out as much about the environment as you wish. So, you know, some of this information is going to live inside people's heads. You know, people that have been in the company for, you know, 10+ years. Some of the information might be stored in certain applications, diagrams, documents, and so on. But again, this isn't an exhausted list, but this is just to kind of give you a bit of some ideas for just some things to consider. So, you know, starting from, you know, the business structure. So, you know, things like the logical structure, right? So departments, regions, business units, and so on. Then obviously the network topology. So that can be things such as your zones, your boundaries, your network security controls, your VLANs, subnets, and so on. Then you have things like your data flow patterns. So whether that's, you know, from cloud to on-prem, whether that's from some critical system over to a third party. Obviously, supply chains are factored into that as well. Then we have things like where your assets are. So whether you have a cloud first kind of initiative, whether you have a kind of blend or hybrid approach of both cloud and on-prem, or perhaps it's even just all on-prem. Then you have, of course, things like critical applications. So these are often referred to as your crown jewel applications. Many organizations have typically, you know, 50 to 100+ crown jewel applications. This can look very different from one company to the next. For example, Active Directory would be considered to be a crown jewel application in one company, but maybe not so in another company. It just completely depends. And then, of course, you have things like your security controls, and this is certainly very relevant to purple teaming, adversary emulation, breach and attack simulation, and so on. So for things like security controls, you're going to want to include things like their features, their capability or capabilities, any installed modules, any policies, whether they're default out-of-the-box policies, whether they're custom policies, and so on, and also who the control owners or the administrators of those controls are, because you're certainly going to need to collaborate with the control owners when you get around to testing for things like TTPs and so on. Now, obviously, Active Directory can help with a lot of this. Again, it just kind of depends. You may have a CMDB where you can pull a lot of this data from. But regardless of, you know, how and where you source this information from, as I say, all of this is going to help you improve in awareness of the environment that you wish and you're planning to test in order to make everyone's lives easier. Like I said before, you know, obviously the data or the environment kind of documentation may or may not be kind of kept up to date. And also you have to factor in that the environment is changing all the time as well. So, you know, maybe some servers are being decommissioned, maybe some new assets are being provisioned in the cloud. So, you know, again, you just need to be mindful of that. Now, I know possibly for the eagle-eyed, some people probably are thinking, well, this sounds a lot like threat modeling. Now that does, of course, there is some similarities there, but for the purpose of breach and attack simulation, you don't necessarily have to go to that kind of length or depth. So it can be still high level by kind of gathering all of this information, or you can go really low level. It really kind of depends what you have at your disposal. You know, for sure, you know, you could take potentially a year or longer to map out the environment if you were to do it properly, but you don't have to go to that length necessarily to get off the ground with breach and attack simulation. And lastly, just on this kind of point, you know, having this information up front not only is going to save you time in the long run, but it's going to help you with things such as, you know, scaling out your assessments across a wider scope within the environment, right? So if you plan to roll out your testing to, you know, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 machines, then it's just going to help you to understand the results, right? Because maybe some machines connect through a certain firewall and certain machines connect through a different firewall vendor. So understanding the environment, understanding your controls, your vendors, etc., is all going to play a very relevant part in breach and attack simulation. But also things like, you know, creating your test plans or, you know, adversary emulation assessments, right? So you could blindly select, you know, assets across your estate from where you want to run and execute scenarios and TTPs against. But again, you might hit challenges with that because maybe certain firewall traffic denies that. And so for the purpose of the test, actually, that may or may not be beneficial. And of course, last but not least, you know, interpreting and triaging and discussing the results, as well as the mitigation and the remediation work that may go with some of these findings, it's all in the grand scheme of things in the overall context of the environment. So the more you have, the more knowledge you have about the environment, it's just going to help aid those discussions going forward. So next up, understanding the security objectives. So this is kind of a common misconception that I've encountered, but about breach and attack simulation tools in general. But some people seem to think that they're just another tool that you kind of install and you kind of treat it as a vulnerability scanner. And, you know, yeah, you probably could treat it like a vulnerability scanner and light everything up, but it's generally not a very good idea. There's lots of reasons for that, and as fun as that might be, it's much wiser to use precision and very, very careful planning. And first and foremost, really, of that planning is understanding these security objectives and the goals, which is ultimately going to help you drive those assessments, right? So in the context, for example, of, you know, adversary emulation or breach and attack simulation, you know, the organization may have regulatory or compliance requirements driving the business, right? So they may be concerned with PCI auditors coming in, they may be concerned with HIPAA or whatever the case may be, right? Perhaps the latest threat of the week is a focus point, for example, maybe like emerging ransomware threats or campaigns. It could be that maybe the threat of the week isn't such a big deal, but maybe a certain nation state actor is, or maybe targeted attacks, right? Hands-on keyboard type attacks, or a threat actor specific to your industry vertical, or even just specifically who's interested or shown interest in your business, right? So, you know, perhaps there's public reports available, perhaps there's even past breach attempts, whether they've been failed or successful attempts, and even attack investigations within your own organization, right? So these may be a priority to you. You know, there's so many different avenues that you can explore here. So you could, you know, maybe only focus on your Windows estate because maybe you think your Mac and Linux estate are super secure, or it could be the opposite, right? It could be that you're interested in only insider threats. It could be that your end goal is to actually just ultimately improve the SOC responsiveness that maybe you're outsourcing to an MSSP, for example. It may be that you're trying to improve your detection engineering and increase the accuracy of your detections and lower the false positiveness of your SOC alerts, right? It could be that, again, you know, if your organization is cloud only, it could be that, again, you know, cloud is still evolving. It's kind of the new hotness in town. So it may be that the cloud-based threats, you know, are more of a concern. oftentimes, ultimately, companies want to test and validate their existing security controls. They want to know if they're working correctly. Are they generating detections in your SIM tools, or even directly through whatever security control that you're using, right? And it also could be for the purpose of testing maybe a third-party supply chain for weaknesses. There's so many other reasons. I didn't want to list them all, but I hope you get the idea. As I say, it's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but the ultimate goal here is to understand the kind of larger initiatives and the objectives of the organization in the context of breach and attack simulation, adversary emulation, and just how the company is trying to think about improving security posture and security maturity. And by laying out the security objectives of the company at the beginning of the project is a really good idea, because it's going to help you steer and guide the project along the way to address whatever it is that is a priority in the testing that you're going to ultimately end up doing. And lastly, remember as well that objectives quite often can and will change. So, good, constructive and ongoing communication and transparency definitely helps to streamline the processes around your testing, because obviously if you're testing for things like SOC alerts, for instance, 1 month, and then suddenly perhaps cloud threats are something that urgently need to be tested because you're just provisioning a load of assets that are going into the cloud, then just be mindful of what each of these goals and objectives entails. So next up, stakeholder support. So to give the best chances of adopting the practice around breach and attack simulation, right, and purple teaming and all the good stuff that comes with it, obtaining the stakeholder support early on is really, really critical. But also what's even more critical is actually, it's equally as important, if not more important, to actually maintain that level of support throughout the projects, right? The goal, remember, the goal is to implement a program and a practice. It's not just to deploy a shiny new tool, right? We can all do that. That's the easy bit. The hard bit is actually working with the different teams, getting them to identify and address findings and how they go about addressing those findings, and obviously ultimately, to improve security posture by remediating and or mitigating those findings, right? So if you have support from the top down, then this in turn gets the work on everybody's radar ultimately, and across all the various security teams as well, ensuring a greater chance of having successful outcomes, which is what we all want, right? We want success. It helps people to stay aligned with their day-to-day work, and it improves visibility across the teams also. Oftentimes teams are very blinkered. They have tunnel vision, not for any fault of their own, but I've been in the in previous roles, right? You're very blinkered. You're the malware guy, or you're the threat research guy, or you're this or you're that, and you live in your own bubble, in your own world. So having that clear communication is really, really key, and it helps, as I say, keep people, everyone aligned and aware of what other teams' workload is as well. And by doing this, just kind of through kind of nature, really, this is ultimately going to help cut through any barriers, which barriers comes in many, many forms. It could be cultural barriers, it could be red tape or politics. Maybe that doesn't exist at all, but there's never a negative thing by communicating the work through the various channels, from the stakeholders down to kind of boots on the ground type people that are clicking the go button, right? But just remember as well, people are busy and often overloaded, so it might not always be top of mind for them. So just something to consider. But you also need to account for the fact that people come and go, right? So depending on their role, they may have the potential to slow the project down significantly if someone suddenly departs the project, right? So again, that's another good reason to have good communication, is because if someone does, for whatever reason, disappear off the project, then if you've got good communication to begin with and you've got good stakeholder support, then hopefully the project will not be hindered too much. And lastly, obviously, communication comes with many forms. It could be a physical meetup, it could be virtual meetups, but ideally, obviously, you want to keep people engaged on a fairly regular cadence. You want to discuss and prioritize the work. You want to identify any challenges as and when they come up, and obviously work towards solving those challenges. anything that might affect the impact of the project, scope creep, etc. Discuss things that are progressing well as things that aren't progressing well. Don't always focus on the negatives, and as well as any action items or key takeaways that need kind of reviewing. Alrighty, so number 4. So if you've got to this point and you're starting to roll out breach attack simulation, it won't be long until you start to accumulate and acquire a fair amount of information, right? So it's a really good idea to agree on a central place to store your work. So this is, this could be anywhere, right? It could be in Microsoft Office, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, etc. Or it could be in Jira, GitHub, Vector.io is pretty cool. It really doesn't matter. But it's just something to consider, particularly if you're rolling out on a global scale. If you have multiple organizations that are kind of participating, and maybe each country or region or business unit is generating their own findings, then it's probably a good idea to kind of share and collaborate, which will ultimately deduplicate some of that workload. So a good idea is to decide on access control early on. So in other words, who has access to what is really important, because obviously the sensitivity of the information that you're going to be collecting over time is really going to be quite eye-opening. So think of it like how red team findings are disseminated, right? So adversary emulation ultimately is going to produce findings, and some of the findings are going to be quite shocking, to be honest. And so ultimately, if this information ends up in the wrong hands, then all the secrets of how to successfully get inside your organization are going to become available, which we obviously really don't want to happen. So, when documenting, account for people leaving, contractors, for example, it's a good idea to document for the most junior and green audience as possible, partly because I think that's just good practice anyway. You should never assume that, someone has the same knowledge as you, but also because of the fact that this space is still kind of evolving. It's still relatively newish. So, this kind of helps account for things like staff churn, and hopefully will ultimately help save on, onboarding time if a new person comes into the project or into the company. So I mentioned as well, planning for scale and growth. So in other words, collaborating on a global scale is ultimately going to help speed up some of the work and deduplicate some of the efforts, particularly if you have a certain firewall brand or a certain EDR brand in one region, and then also in a different region as well, right? So it seems silly to kind of duplicate, but obviously there may be times where that's unavoidable. Obviously sharing the results can improve awareness and understanding, but most importantly, how an adversary might be able to circumvent parts of that network, right? So again, some of the information that you are likely to document along the way, and again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it will vary from one company to the next. But things like security control specific configuration details, which you're going to learn over time, how your controls respond or don't respond, or prevent or don't prevent, for example. You're going to have config specific information around the assessment or the testing that you're doing, around the detection information that you're seeing or not seeing in your SIM or in your security control, right? So that could be a raw log message as an artifact. There's going to be information around mitigation and remediation, the TTP procedural level details that you're actually executing, whether they're atomic, whether they're anatomic type of tests, and so on. So, in summary, sharing and collaborating iteratively will improve your efficiency as a global team on a global scale, and will enable you to quickly track backwards to a point in time. And as I say, if you're rolling out globally, can particularly help with just making life a lot easier and hopefully a little bit less painful. All right, so next up we have detection versus prevention. So a common approach that I've seen is, a company obviously wants to prevent everything right off the bat. But in practice, though, that isn't always possible and may not even be feasible. Now, some TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures can be quite complex to fully prevent due to various dependencies, for example, and that becomes further complicated by legacy systems that cannot be patched, cannot have their configurations changed for whatever reason. Maybe there's a critical medical device connected to an old Windows OS, for example. So just something to be mindful of. Now, obviously, you can't prevent what you can't see, right? So once you have something, once you have findings to raise, then you can't unsee them. So, in my opinion, detection is often a more realistic goal in the near term, unless, of course, detection is already working within your organization. Now, it really doesn't matter. This is just a personal choice. It depends on the maturity, whether you want to focus more on the prevention side or the detection or both. I mean, ultimately, you want to end up doing both. There isn't a kind of right or wrong approach to this. It's just something to be mindful of. But again, another reason for this is because prevention isn't always, as I say, possible. As well, if there's critical financial systems, or just any kind of crown jewel assets that cannot easily be remediated, for example. And that's where kind of having a defense in depth approach comes into play here, because ultimately that's going to help when it comes to not just your critical assets or crown jewel assets, but if something can't be remediated or mitigated, then you can kind of trace back through the attack chain, maybe look at an earlier TTP, a precursory TTP. It could be that you look at the next control above, just kind of almost kind of treating it like a timeline of an attack and try and find the earliest point of the attack chain, right? So just something to be aware of there. And just to give you a quick visual kind of clue on this, so as a quick example, this slide shows a quick visual of the Attack Navigator tool. So as you can see, shown in blue, these are the techniques that are highlighted that have that include mitigations. In contrast, the coverage for data sources is much higher, as they're shown with in green here. So the point here is that ultimately, MITRE ATT&CK has something like 500 plus techniques and sub-techniques in the matrix. So, again, there's no right or wrong way of doing this, whether you focus on prevention or detection. Ultimately, the coverage is improving all the time in the matrix. So it's just a personal choice. And lastly, this slide just shows the behavior prevention for endpoint mitigations, right? So again, you can approach prevention and detection on a kind of per security control basis. So this is filtered by endpoint prevention, behavior prevention. Again, you can kind of play around with this in the Attack Navigator, but the idea here is, if you want to take a control focused approach, if you want to take a threat actor approach, that's entirely up to you, but it's just something to be aware of what your priorities are. So next up, we have direct, or what I refer to as direct or indirect findings. So you can think of this as, a direct finding as an example would be something like, WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation event subscription using a MOF file is prevented by or detected by some security control. So there's a very clear-cut kind of, true or false, binary kind of representation of it was either prevented and or detected, or it wasn't. So that's what I consider as a direct finding. However, along the journey, you're going to come across lots of different kind of indirect findings, which are going to be so equally almost as important as the control testing that you're doing yourself. So as a couple of examples, let's say you're running an assessment and you're exfiltrating some benign data. Now, let's say that the detection, well, let's say, regardless really of whether the detection happened 4 hours, 2 hours, whatever, but for the example, let's say that the detection did arrive, but it came in 4 hours for the alert to actually show up, subsequently meaning that the SOC actually missed that alert. Now, maybe it's a managed SOC, right? So maybe they don't actually respond anything to any alert over 2 hours, for example, or maybe it's 1 hour. It depends what the SLA is. In the next example, if we invoke a process using WMIC process called create, and let's say it wasn't prevented, but it's not that it wasn't prevented because the tool didn't prevent it. Maybe it was just not prevented rather, because the sensor was not checking in. Maybe there'd been a failed upgrade on that sensor, and maybe there's no sensor installed at all. Maybe there's a wrong policy that got applied somewhere along the line, or maybe there could be a bunch of other reasons, right? But ultimately, what that led to was the test binary successfully being able to launch on that particular asset. So these are indirect findings where it may not actually be the control itself that's failed to prevent or detect, but usually kind of symptomatic of other reasons surrounding that control. And it's not always controls as well. It could be people, it could be process failures and various things like that. So as I say, you're going to likely observe a lot of these findings in different formats, either direct findings or indirect findings. But ultimately, this is all good stuff because ultimately it's going to help improve your security posture. So nearing the end, and conscious I'm running out of time now, so I'll try and be quick for these last few slides. So number 7, so start small, right? So I mentioned this earlier, it takes careful planning and time and precision to scope out a successful assessment. It helps to have all the stuff I've mentioned before. It helps to have good communication. It helps to have environment information to hand. It's a good idea to have test assets available to you where you can essentially perform unit testing before rolling out to a wider scope of assets in the environment. You know, unit testing doesn't have to take too long. It's a good idea just to have at least one test asset. It can be a kind of disposable virtual machine, for instance, but it's also useful to have some kind of baseline as well for your environment where possible, so something to compare against. So as an example, you may have a Windows machine with a gold image. That would be a great test if you can allocate a test machine, whether it's a physical or virtual machine, and it just helps you to compare and contrast results. And when you've performed sufficient testing, you know, only test in production when you're confident there is minimal risk and impact to your production assets. Now, obviously, one of the big mantras that we have at Attack IQ is we only test everything in production, right? That's how confident we are. We make all of our source code available. You know, we have no secret as to how we execute our TTPs and scenarios. So we expose that in the UI. And so testing a test asset or against a test asset should be quite a straightforward kind of process. And then, you know, you can deploy on the masses and get up to speed pretty quickly. So related to this is also quality versus quantity. So again, kind of alluded to this earlier, right? So breach and attack simulation is not to be compared with a vulnerability scanner. So, you know, it's not a race. So plan what you want to test, where you want to test. Don't execute all the TTPs in the hope that this will save you time in the long run, because I can assure you it will not. It will give you a load of information and results, and someone has to go through that meticulously. So, you know, just be mindful of that. You know, the more TTPs you test, the more assets you test, the more results that you have to review, and you need humans ultimately to sift through that data and, you know, then have lots of discussions with various teams to, you know, potentially, you know, plug any holes, remediate, mitigate, etc. So yeah, and lastly, again, this is just an opinion. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but I think a good place to start is actually the network. So network level testing. So testing things like traffic, inbound and outbound traffic, simply because, you know, it's a little bit more easier to have that kind of discussion with people. You know, you can talk to things like source or destination traffic, protocol ports, and so on. It's a little bit easier to digest. The results are kind of a bit more binary. It's kind of true, false, either the firewall or IDS did or didn't do a signature match, or, you know, the firewall, you know, allowed or denied the traffic, right? So network is, in some ways, it's a little bit easier to have those discussions. But again, that's just my opinion. Obviously, we have boundary posture management, which we are able to do a bunch of testing, both internally, east to west, as well as north to south, south to north. So, which is cool. So next up, purple teaming. So if you're running breach and attack simulation or adversary emulation and so on, there's a very good chance that you've heard of purple teaming. There's probably even better chance that you even want to start your own purple team. But yeah, it's definitely a good idea to establish one very early on. Remember that a purple team is a logical concept. So it's not a physical team. You don't need to go out and hire 20 people and put job adverts out for a purple teamer, right? They can be part of your existing security teams. There's no kind of hard and fast rule for this. Yes, traditionally people think, you know, it's a combination of red and blue, and that is definitely true. You can extend that as well. It can look very different from one company to the next. So you can have your red and blue team for sure. You can have incident responders. You can have SOC analysts. You can have, you know, cyber threat intelligence analysts and so on. You can also have subject matter experts for each of the security controls. You can have sysadmins, right? Whoever, bring whoever you want to the party. But obviously, the more insights that you get from various people, then the more productive and constructive those conversations are going to be. So as I mentioned before, the key security goals and objectives will likely come up in these discussions, and is a great chance to discuss and review them as well at a kind of lower level. It's also important to remember that these meetings are designed to support and augment each other's workloads, right? So ultimately working towards a common goal, having that visibility and transparency. I mentioned before, it's also another great way to break down barriers in the operational kind of level. And lastly, these meetings will help in understanding the narrative or story that you're trying to tell higher up the chain, maybe to the C-suite or the general security leadership team. Automation. So ultimately, if you're repeating a task more than once, it's a good idea to look at automating it, providing it's feasible and worthy of the time investment, right? So, automated testing is pretty useful when it comes to highlighting environmental drift. We obviously have a load of ways that we already provide automation out of the box with Attack IQ. But think of other ways that you may be able to kind of automate. So for example, if you have a red team in the company and they are successful every single month or every single quarter that they run their red team operations, then maybe we can automate that in the form of an attack graph or an attack flow, for instance. That's just one example. Obviously, we have we have an API in Attack IQ. We have various ways that we provide automation. We can have schedules that run hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, etc. But obviously, if you're not an Attack IQ customer, or if you're new to breach and attack simulation, these are just some of the kind of areas to consider if you're kind of looking to get into this area. Obviously, other things like integrating with security controls, CTI ingestion, lots of other things there. And last but not least, slow and steady wins the race. So there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that adversary emulation and breach and attack simulation and purple teaming is very much here to stay. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, right? They are increasingly being well received and adopted by a growing number of organizations. And due to their nature, implementing a project or a practice which touches on all aspects of security, from the people, the processes, the technologies, etc. It's all really positive stuff. So from my experience, I've personally seen drastic improvements in communication, camaraderie between team workers, improved workflows, greater visibility, collaboration. It's all really positive stuff. But it can take a while to get there. So depending on the size and the complexity of the organization, obviously this is going to change or look very different from one company to the next. So, enjoy the journey, right? This is a fun project or practice. It's exciting times to be a part of it, if you're a part of it or if you're about to be a part of it. So you need to stay motivated and, lots of persistence required in terms of driving things forward in the right direction. And lastly, there's a ton of free resources out there. So obviously the Attack IQ Academy, we have upwards of 30,000 global students participating and members of our free Attack IQ Academy. So definitely check out the great content on there. We obviously are a founding member of the MITRE Ingenuity Center for Threat Informed Defense. So there's a ton of projects you should definitely check out. Some of those projects we've very much been a big part of. Obviously, I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with MITRE ATT&CK, but obviously check out MITRE ATT&CK's website. It's evolving all the time, as well as that, the Attack Navigator tool. And a cool one that I came across quite recently is the Control Validation Compass as well. So there's loads of other resources out there, but those are kind of my go-to if I was to suggest any to anyone coming into this. So to wrap up, that's the aim of my talk was really just to share with you my top tips based on my own journey. Hopefully I've accomplished that somewhat. I wanted to share some insights into some areas to consider. So again, this can look very different from one company to the next. Hopefully they all made some kind of sense. Hopefully they kind of resonated with you at some level. But ultimately, I hope that some of these top 10 tips will help you to kind of demonstrate value faster, deploy faster, get off the ground faster, and ultimately increase the chances of a successful implementation of a breach and attack simulation tool, implementing purple teaming and all that other good stuff. And just to ultimately be aware of some of the challenges that you might face when you're implementing the program and the practice around it. So I think I'm out of time, so unfortunately no questions today, but You've got my contact details, so feel free to reach out. And sorry for slightly overrunning, but enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you all again at some point. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.